Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In 1944, Naples, Italy was a city in turmoil. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be speaking with award-winning author Keith Lowe about his powerful new book, Naples, 1944, The Devil's Paradise at War. Lowe will recount the gripping World War II story of a city that endured relentless Allied bombing, rose up against a brutal German occupation, and then struggled through the severe hardships that followed its liberation by American and British forces. Hardships that included starvation, widespread corruption, and the dangers of the black market. Stay with us for this remarkable story of resilience in the face of war and its aftermath. I'd now like to welcome Keith Lowe to our show. Welcome, Keith.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Absolutely. Now, you live in London, do you, Keith?
I do, yeah, North London. Been here for all my life. I was born here, and I grew up here, and I intend to die here too.
Well, Keith, I have just finished reading your book, Naples, 1944, The Devil's Paradise at War. And it is a tremendous book. I am a big enthusiast for studying World War II. Both my parents were in the Second World War in the military, and it's been a topic of great interest to me. But what I found about this book was just that there was so many new facts, new things that I learned from your book about Naples, Italy, and the general involvement of Italy in the Second World War, and of course the period immediately before and afterwards. And it was just, I was just dumbfounded. I kept stopping and telling my wife, guess what it said? I didn't know this. This is unbelievable. And the different dynamics about what happened because of World War II in Naples, Italy. So thank you for that. But I wanted to say something. I noticed I was looking at some of the other books that you've written. One was Savage Continent, Europe in the Aftermath of World War II. And the other one was Inferno, The Devastation of Hamburg in 1943. Now, those are books related to World War II, but it's not like they're not military books, so to speak, right? They're really
No,
what
no.
happens because of it. Could you talk about why you have this particular interest in World War II?
Well, yeah, I mean, that my interest in World War II is not about sort of tanks and battles and I do find that interesting, but what really gets me is the much wider effects that it has on whole societies. Women, children, grandparents, they get affected by war too. And sometimes, actually, World War II is one example where civilians actually suffered much worse than the military did. So, yeah, my focus has always been on how wars affect ordinary people like you and me. That's what gets me going. I like to put myself in their shoes, see and think about what I would do in that kind of situation.
Yeah, when you think of it, when you hear about military casualties during First, Second World War, the civilian populations were just the casualties were just astronomical, weren't they?
Yeah, horrendous. I mean, from every country involved, it was the civilians who really got it more. I mean, not so much America because civilians are far away from the fighting, but anywhere that was actually had armies passing through, it was the civilians who really got the brunt of it.
Yes, and the civilians of Naples were a good example of a population that really suffered a lot because of the effects of the Second World War. The book talks about, the fascists and then the Germans and then the Allies and then the internal politics and fighting and all that. But let's talk about Naples, first of all. Why did you specifically choose to write about the story of Naples during the war? What was it about that city?
Well, I mean, apart from the fact that it's just a really cool city, I mean, I love that city. I've known it since I was a kid, and It was also the first major city on mainland Europe to be liberated. So, what happened here was what was going to happen to all the other cities as they were liberated along the way. So I thought this was a good way of explaining what's happening all across Europe in the aftermath of war, just by focusing on a single place. And if it's going to be a cool place like Naples, or that all to the bet, all to the better.
So, Keith, where in the boot of Italy is the city of Naples?
Okay, it's about halfway down. It's probably it's just south of Rome. So if you know where Rome is, sort of halfway down the boot, it's another couple of hours on a train south of there. And historically, it's always been the sort of capital city of the south. So there aren't any other major cities in the south apart from Naples. So it's always been like the center of this sort of southern half of Italy.
And as far as the period right before World War II, before this story really begins, and of course you actually go back and talk about periods way further back in history and how Naples was part of that. But let's talk about the period right before World War II. Can you tell us what was set the stage for that city, say within like 20 years before the war?
Okay, well, I mean, Naples has historically always been it's been quite impoverished, It's always overlooked in Italy. All the sort of main industry and so on, and all the political centers are all up north. So Naples is always a bit ignored. And Mussolini came to power in the 20s. He made a point of saying, no, we're going to kind of make Naples great again, I suppose you could say. He wanted to get the people of Naples to feel a bit of pride and set up Naples as like the capital of Italy and the Mediterranean. He said it was the queen of the Mediterranean. So it was going to be the sort of heart of the new idea of Italian empire in North Africa and so on. It was where everybody, when they were going off to the empire, they embarked on ships from Naples. So yeah, it was a way he just wanted to sort of big up Naples and give it more of a sense of pride in its history and in its future. So that was how he was setting things up before the war began.
Now, I think I read that it was in Naples where Mussolini sort of announced that he was going to be marching on Rome. Didn't that happen in Naples?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. He gave a famous speech in the San Carlo Theatre saying, the fascist revolution starts here, and we're going to march on Rome, and then fascists from all over the country all began their march on Rome, and then the king sort of capitulated and handed over power to Mussolini. But it was in Naples that he announced it.
Now, in Naples itself, were they big followers of Mussolini and his fascists, or weren't there also socialists and communists and other political parties in that city?
Absolutely, yeah. And there was it's a melting pot of every kind of different political persuasion there. There was I mean, I say a lot of the industry is up north, but actually in the south, it's Naples is the only sort of major center of industry. And along with all the factories and so on, you had a sort of big trade union movement. There were also a lot of communists there. So alongside the people who are really enthusiastic about Mussolini, there are a lot of people who really hate him. So it's a real melting pot. It's difficult to say Naples is one thing or the other. It's a big mixture.
Hmm. And so, as the war broke out, so Mussolini sided with Hitler. And
Yep.
what happened during the first part of the war when, Mussolini was in power and they were fighting with the Germans against the Allies?
Yeah, well, it didn't go well. All the enthusiasm there was for war at the beginning, they very quickly realized what the reality was going to be. Suddenly, there's a lot of hardship. There's, trade disappears. They had this big idea as well that Naples is going to be this big tourist destination before the war. Well, war's not going to allow that to happen. So all the tourism collapses, and so people start to go hungry in Naples. Enthusiasm for the war very quickly sort of tapers off. And then they start getting quite resentful of all the Germans who are turning up and ordering people around. So, the rosy idea of what war would bring uh, never materializes and actually produces its opposite.
So during the war, though, Naples, they were actually under fire from the Allies.
Oh God, yes, yes. I mean, Naples is it's a major city of industry, so it's a target. It's also the closest city to North Africa, which where all the Allied bombers are. And once they've invaded, once the Allies have got into Sicily, again, Naples is the closest city. So that's the one that gets bombed. It is more heavily bombed than any other city in the whole of Italy. It was bombed more than 100 times during the war. So really quite devastating for the city.
I had no idea. So the you had Mussolini in charge. So I imagine you had Italian soldiers in Naples. You also had some German units in Naples, and they're
Yeah.
being attacked by the Allies. So could you take us to the next step where sort of the war starts to turn and the people of Naples and Italy in general starts to decide that they don't want any part of this Mussolini character anymore?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, the war is going badly for Italy. They've lost hundreds of thousands of troops taken prisoner in North Africa. It's obvious they're beginning to lose the war. They've lost Sicily by the summer of 1943, and now they're getting bombed. They're really getting bombed to hell, especially in Naples, but all over Italy. Naples is just it's like a microcosm of what's happening everywhere else. So there is great pressure to swap sides, basically, or at least surrender, at least stop fighting, draw up a truce with the Allies. And that's kind of what happens behind the scenes in the summer of 1943. They get rid of Mussolini, arrest him. The king arrests him, puts him in prison, and they start up a new government, which is supposedly not fascist, although almost everybody in it has been in the fascist party too. And yeah, so they begin negotiations with the Allies, and of course the Germans are not stupid. They get wind of this, and they know they're going to lose Italy. So the moment that the armistice is announced, the Germans take over. They just march into all the barracks all over the country, arrest as many Italian soldiers as possible, and just take over. They take over the whole country. So that's where we are in at the beginning of September 1943.
Yes, and now you've got foreign soldiers now pretty much running the show in your city, and you've also they're sort of done with this war, and yet they've got the Germans there. Now that's going to draw more fire by the Allies, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the Germans are a different kind of foe to the Italians. I mean, you've got to feel sorry for the ordinary guy in the street in Italy because, at the beginning of war, they're against the Allies, and now they switch sides. So, the when the Allies arrive, they're angry. Especially British soldiers who've been fighting against Italians for years. They're angry with the local Italians. But in the meantime, if you're in the German bit of Italy, the Germans are also angry with you because you've betrayed them. So whichever side you're going to be on, you're always going to be the butt of the local, powers in charge. So it's pretty tough for the Italians in at the end of 1943.
Your book makes that abundantly clear, I'll tell you. Wow. And so, but the populace in Naples, the Germans, they're not just like hanging out and being nice people there. They're starting to put down any resistance that there are, and aren't they starting to break up the infrastructure and try to do damage to the city? Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. It's terrible. I mean, what happens in September 1943 in Naples is just astonishingly cruel. I mean, the Allies by this point they've landed at Salerno, which is just it's about sort of 30 miles south of Naples. So the Allies are on their way, and the Germans know the Allies are on their way, and they don't want to leave anything in Naples that the Allies can use. So if they can't take it with them, I mean, they take away all the trucks, all the cars, all the supplies, all the food, petrol supplies, and so on. They just take that north with them. But anything they can't carry, they blow up. So they blow up the port, they blow up the all the factories, they blow up the hotels because of course the Allies can stay in the hotels and use them as billets. They blow up the sewers, they blow up the water system, they blow up the electricity supplies. I mean, they completely destroy whatever hasn't been destroyed by bombs. The Germans then destroy themselves, and then to kind of add insult to injury, they then start rounding up the local population and trying to cart them off as slave labor. So they're trying to arrest all the men and take them off to use as slave labor further north. So it's brutal. It's really brutal. And anybody who resists, they just put them up against the wall and shoot them. There are massacres all over the city in September 43. So it's a really brutal time for the Neapolitans.
Yeah, and it seems like the impressment of these Italian young men into work camps and stuff like that, that was kind of the last straw for the people who would eventually resist the Germans. And so how did that come about?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the local people. I mean, the Italians are let down by their own senior officers. The generals, they all just sort of run away or go into hiding. So it's left to sort of junior officers, lieutenants, and sorry, lieutenants, as you say in the States, and the odd captain here and there to try and organize the troops to resist the Germans. And that gets put down in a matter of days because they just don't have the resources. And then this terrible stuff happens for the next 3 weeks. And it's like you said, yeah, when they start impressing the local population and trying to cart them off, that's when the whole city rises up as one. And not just the men, the women, the children, everybody, they start building barricades. They, the women are there loading the rifles. The kids are running between the barricades, sort of handing out ammunition, and the men are there, sort of, and some of the women too are there on the barricades shooting at Germans. There's a couple of kids who are awarded gold medals of valor for running onto tanks and throwing sort of Molotov cocktails at tanks and so on. Doesn't tend out to end up very well for those kids. They a kid against a tank, you can imagine what happens. But still, that gives the idea of the spirit of resistance that the city has to the Germans. And it works. In 4 days, they kick the Germans out of the city, so by the time the Allies arrive, the city has already pretty much been liberated by the local people themselves.
Wow. And they were the first city in Europe to actually push the Germans out, like defeat the Germans in their city.
Yeah, I mean, it's what amazes me is that people don't know this. I mean, if you look for an English language book about this uprising, you can't find one. I mean, I believe me, I looked, which is, another good reason for writing this book was to tell that story. It is the first major uprising against the Germans by an entire city in Europe. There's one or two ghetto uprisings in Poland, but a whole city rising up against them. This is the first one. So we should know more about it. It's an amazing story. I mean, even in Italy, it's not that well known a story. There are quite a few Italian books about it, but they tend, people in Naples read about it, but people up in the north, in Turin or Milan or something, they tend not really to know about what happened down south, which is, a shame because they're a big part of the Italian story, and it's a good story. It's a story of heroism.
Oh, it is. Now, the Germans who have been pushed out are mad as wet hens, as they say. They are angry. They were used to fighting, armies, and they were up against this sort of, you know, rooftop snipers and street fighting, and they didn't know where the next shot was going to come from. So they were kind of set off their balance from these resistance fighters, and they were defeated and they were pushed out and they were angry.
They
But
really were.
what really impacted me was how you told the story of when the Germans left Naples and started pushing north into some of the smaller villages around, and the atrocities that they committed was just Oh my gosh, it was awful.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that makes Naples a success is, I mean, to start with, it's a city of around about 1 million people. So it's a big place. There's a lot of people fighting, but also the terrain. I mean, if you've ever been to Naples, you'll know it's a city of very narrow alleys, incredibly tall buildings, but really narrow alleys. So if you're a German, so you can't get a tank down these places. You can barely get a car down them. So they can't bring in any armor. They're reduced to fighting on foot, and you're surrounded, and you have people above firing down on you. It's really dangerous. So they just couldn't defend the city. They had to leave. But once you get out to the smaller towns outside where the roads are a bit wider, there's a smaller population, any resistance that came up at all was treated ruthlessly. I mean, they literally in Bellona, for example, Acerra is another one. They went from house to house and they took the people out and just shot them there and then. Some places they just bulldozed through houses, set fire to whole villages. I mean, it's horrible. Some of the stories about what happened in these smaller places. It was just a way of crushing any kind of resistance before it really came up.
Yeah, I mean, there was one story that you told, if I may, where a man tried to, he was a wealthy man. He invited the Germans into his house to give them a meal, I guess, to try to, keep them calm and maybe be friendly with him so that they would leave him alone. And that they ate his food and then burned his house down and killed him and I think his members of his family. And it just struck me as the ruthlessness of the retreating Germans. It was unbelievable. But let's move now to the knights in white armor, in quotes, the Allies. So can you take us now to the Allied occupation of Naples?
Yeah, I mean, when the Allies first rolled in on 1st of October 1943, they arrived in the city. Mark Clark was arrived in the east of the city, and the Brits arrived in the north and the west. Um, the crowds came out and celebrated. They were so happy to see them. I've got photos in the book of crowds of people literally running forward with their arms spread wide, big smiles on their faces. They're just so happy to see the Allies. And this was justified in the beginning. You know, the Allies did whatever they could to try and get the city back up and running because they needed it. You know, they've got a war to win and they're going to need somewhere like Naples as a base. So they pulled out all the stops to get that city back up and running. And within a few days, they managed to get the water kind of back on again. They were repairing the sewers. They were handing out, where people didn't have any water, they brought in water supply trucks to try and make sure that people didn't, die of thirst. And uh, they fixed up the port because, without the port, you can't bring in any supplies. And that's important for the local people as well as for the war. No supplies means no food for the locals and no tanks for the front. So yeah, they managed to get the port back up and running within, I think the first Liberty ship docked there within about 3 or 4 days, which, given that the Germans had sunk 300 ships in the harbour and covered it in mines and blown up all the installations. I mean, it's incredible how quickly they managed to get that place back up and running. Yeah, so it was the first sort of couple of weeks was a real kind of love fest between the Allies and the local people. Everybody was happy to see the others.
Terrific. Everything's great. Now, one other victory I know that the Allies did have as far as helping the people of Naples was the way they handled the outbreak of typhus.
Yeah, I mean the conditions that people were living in Naples were pretty dire. A lot of people just they didn't have any homes to live in anymore because they'd been blown up. So they took to living in the bomb shelters and underground in tunnels and in caves and so on, and in incredibly overcrowded conditions. So everyone's squashed up together. There's no sort of washing facilities in these places. There's no soap in the city anyway. That's all been taken away. There's no fresh water because all the water mains have been blown up. So typhus starts to spread in the air raid shelters and in the caves and so on. And this becomes a real problem. By the end of 1943, there is a massive epidemic sweeping through the city. And of course, the Allies are terrified this is going to spread to their troops. So they've got to do something about it. And they bring in the American specialist for the American army who's like an expert on this. And it's like a sort of, I mean, we all remember lockdown, right? It was like that, but it was, 1943, 1944. They locked down the entire city. They used DDT powder to kill the insects that spread the typhus. And they, in the course of just a few months, they put this powder on over 1 million people in the city. It was an incredible operation. It was considered a miracle at its time. Nobody had ever seen anyone do this in a city before, and it worked. I mean, we all know about DDT now. It's a bit dangerous, but it worked. It killed the typhus dead, and within a few months, Naples was free of typhus. It was a real miracle.
Yeah, I can imagine just being doused in all that powder and what happened years later from the health effects of DDT. But so the Allies are getting the water system up and running. They're getting rid of the lice. That sounds pretty good. They're opening the port again. So everything's great under the Allies, right?
Well, yes. I mean, look, it's better than it was before. They'd rather have the Allies there than the Germans, but the Allies are fighting a war. All their attention really is on fighting this war. So, keeping the sort of local people happy and well fed, and giving them political representation. I mean, none of that is a priority. So, as a consequence, they don't bring enough food into the city, so people start to starve. They don't, they devalue the lira in order to be able to buy more stuff for themselves so they can feed the war. But that means suddenly there's huge inflation in the city and prices go up. People can't afford to buy the food on the black market, which is the only place they can get it. And so, yeah, so they begin to starve. And some of the stories of the malnutrition and what people have to do in order to feed their families are really quite heartbreaking during this time.
Yeah, it seemed like hunger was like the main thing. It seems that what I understand from reading your story, your book, is that the Allies kind of felt that Naples would be able to feed itself because there's fertile land around and all that. But I guess a lot of that was churned up by tanks and that there wasn't the ability to get the food into the city. So it's not like I guess the Allies thought that, oh, I don't care if they starve, but I guess was it that they felt that they would be able to feed themselves?
Yeah, they were just a bit complacent. They had all these, you know, Naples is surrounded by some of the most fertile land in the world, and it's sort of famed because you got Vesuvius, the volcano there, nice volcanic soil. So it's famed for its fruit and vegetables and so on. Um, Problem is you can't just live on fruit and vegetables. You've got other stuff to eat. Uh, and also you've got to get the fruit and vegetables from the countryside into the city. And all of the transport infrastructure has been blown up. So there's no way of getting the stuff there. So yeah, they didn't really think it through properly, and they didn't have the resources to change all of this quickly. So yeah, it caused a sort of almost a famine really at the time.
Yeah, and you pointed this out as well that in other parts of Europe where the Allies came back into control, they sort of held some of the local political people who may have been supporting the fascists and things like that, held them responsible, took them out of office. But I guess the Allies were not as efficient doing that down in the Naples area. Is that true?
Well, I mean, they were not too bad actually. I mean, the initial impulse was to, you go into a town, you remove the mayor because he's always going to be a fascist, and you appoint someone else. The problem is they supported this Italian government who were the successors to Mussolini, and the Italian government they're all former fascists. And the king is also an apologist for fascism, and he upheld Mussolini for years. And the Allies are determined to keep these people in charge. So as they hand territory back over to the Italian government, all the Italian government do, they get rid of the guy the Allies appointed and stick the old fascist back in charge. So that's what happens all over the country. Yeah, so no change, no change from the fascists, really.
Wow. So you've got this starvation going on. Yeah, now you got people who are not so happy with the Allies because, as you point out, as you tell this story, that the Allies who, we think, hey, they're the good guys. They're coming in. They've liberated the city from the Germans. These Allies do have food in their stomach. They are well supplied. They're clean. People in the city are starving. And, what could go wrong with thousands of young men, who have things to trade, plenty of things to trade with the people in the town? It made me sour against our own British and American allies a little bit. The human nature sort of the bad side of human nature popped out, and you tell that story, and it is heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking. Yeah, because, I mean, compared to the Germans, we're still the good guys, right? But you've got a whole army. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people are all stationed around Naples, fighting a war just up the road in Cassino. The battle lines get fixed for a long time, so the war's not moving anywhere. So you have all these young men. A lot of them are sort of traumatized. A lot of them think they're going to die tomorrow. So what have they got to lose? So when they go on leave in Naples, and they all do because it's the only place to go and do anything. It's only the only city there is to go and have a party. They've got 5 days to spend all their cash, which they've been saving up for the last 6 months, and so they spend it on booze to start off with. So drunkenness is a really huge problem in the city. I spent a week going through Italian police reports, and they're full of stories of like the Allied soldiers falling in front of lorries in the road, or Allied soldiers falling into the harbour because they're so drunk. One guy even fell off a cliff at Capri because he was so drunk. And then on top of that, you have the stories of them harassing the local women. And you know, there's a lot of, it's not just catcalling and whistling and stuff. There's people who are drunk and are just grabbing women and trying to drag them off. There are loads of stories like that in the police reports as well. But the majority of troops, they don't need to drag off the women because the women are hungry and they've got loads of food. They've got money in their pocket and they've got cans of food in their backpacks. So, they don't need to drag off a woman if they can just offer her food. And so they do. The statistics around prostitution at the time are eye-watering. We're talking 40,000 women forced into prostitution by being hungry during the war. So that's 10% of the female population of Naples.
That yeah, that is a sad story, and I know the leadership. It seemed that there were problems as far as the logistics of getting food to the area. There was a lot of bureaucracy you talk about, and it's like almost set up to fail. It seems. What happens then as the war actually ends? What happens to Naples when the war ends?
Well, when the war ends, I mean, Naples is more damaged than anywhere else, really. So, you know, come 1945 up to sort of 48, when Marshall Plan aid, for example, starts coming into Europe, and there's a lot of aid which is going in before the Marshall Plan, by the way, that all gets funneled up north to rebuild places like Turin and Milan, which are less badly damaged. So you can get the economy going much more quickly up there. Naples kind of languishes behind, and it's been behind ever since World War II. It's never properly recovered in the way that the other cities recovered. And so there was a lot of resentment in Naples for the fact that it was kind of left behind. And up north they had all the stories about, the resistance up there, and they were the ones who fought off the Germans during, they've got the sort of the story, and the Neapolitan story is forgotten. They've also got all the money, and Naples is forgotten again. And then the politics as well, that's all goes up to Rome. And, once again, Naples is left out of the equation. So there was a lot of resentment at the end of the war for what had happened and how the war had affected the city.
And there was also the fact that I guess during the time of the Allied occupation, that a lot of the buildings that could have been used for, I guess, factories or to get the city back up and running again were being used by the military. And that was
Yeah.
a problem too, right?
Yeah, yeah, I know that's a terrible problem. I mean, what this is the thing that really gets me. They spent a fortune. The Allies spent a fortune on bringing food into the city. When all around Naples, you've got all this fertile land and all these fruit and vegetables and so on. There are canning factories all around Naples. None of them were rebuilt during the war, so they could have been canning their own food and supplying themselves, and that would have freed up shipping space for the Allies to bring in more weapons, but there was no joined up thinking at the time, and they didn't think to do that. They just sort of carried on the way they were going. So opportunities were lost all round.
Yeah, and I guess the big thing, as you pointed out before, I mean, the Allies were prosecuting the war. They wanted to crush the Third Reich and put the war to an end. It's easy, I guess, for us or for me to say, oh, they could have done this or they should have done that. But I guess if we had been in their spot, it'd be hard to know what we would have done because there were so many moving pieces, weren't there?
Yeah, there were absolutely, and that's kind of what played out. But that doesn't mean there weren't people at the time, who were saying these things. Adlai Stevenson went there on a mission to find out what was happening in Naples because he knew that what was happening there was going to happen to the whole of the rest of Europe. And he saw the mind-boggling inefficiency of the way that the Allies were running things, and made all kinds of suggestions, which basically added up to the Marshall Plan. Except for he's suggesting it in 1944, not in 1948. So these things could have been done if they'd just listened to the experts who were speaking at the time, but they didn't. They carried on as they were, and your military machinery takes a long time to change. It doesn't just happen overnight. It takes a lot of politicking to get the military people to change their minds along the way.
Yes, and now. How is Naples today? Have you been there recently?
I was there 3 weeks ago, in fact. Yeah, I love that city. I go whenever I can. And my sister lives in Italy as well. It's Naples today is kind of it's on the up now. There's a lot more prosperity there than there was even 20, 30 years ago. There's a thriving tourism industry there now. If you want to go, I suggest now is the time to go before yeah, before it gets filled with tourists
Yep.
like Rome or Florence is.
Hmm.
Um,
I've heard that you mentioned that they have a great sense of humor in Naples.
Yes, out of all the Italians, I mean, every different region has its own characteristic, but Naples has always been the funny part of Italy. They've got fantastic comedians there. They're known for their, while the Romans make all these sort of bleak films about post-war Europe that are always very, people dying over lack of food or lack of a bicycle or whatever. In Naples, they made comedies about it. How the local people got one up over the Germans and then over the Americans and over the British, sort of by being underhand and clever. And it's always a comedy. And they don't take themselves seriously. They're happy to laugh at themselves in a way that Northerners not so much. So yeah, I love it for that.
Yeah, Keith, you mentioned about going through all those police reports, and it is so evident the research that you did for this book was just incredible. How long did it take you to put all this together into this book?
It took me about 3 years. I mean, strictly speaking, 4 years, but one of those was during lockdown when everything was closed. So I don't really count that. Yeah, 3 years of going through archives and being really helped actually by archivists in Italy, in the States, here in the UK. The help I've had along the way has been amazing. I'm so grateful to all those people who run those places on a shoestring budget often. Really, really helpful.
I've spoken to some other authors who have gone on journeys like you have to dig and find out information that's not really readily available. And I've heard similar reports about archivists who have been just so nice and so helpful. That's good to hear, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It really gives you a real faith in human nature that they're at no profit to themselves whatsoever. They're just willing to help. They're just happy to be sharing the information. It's wonderful.
There's so much more that when people read your book that they're going to find out. I mean, the Vesuvius decides to erupt in the middle of all that, and there's the big. You mentioned the black market. There's the organized crime component of that. Then there's the good things that the Allies learned how from the mistakes made in Naples to make improvements in the rest of Europe. So there's just so many great, brilliant stories in here, and I would recommend it to anybody, any enthusiast of or history lover of particularly World War II. But I think it's a great in-depth exploration of like social changes, economic changes that are made because of bad events such as wars, and that war is not just a military function. There's so many more people who are impacted by them. It impacted for decades afterwards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like I said, the poverty in Naples lasted for decades as a consequence of what happened during these years.
Yeah.
It's only just coming out of it now, really.
Yes. And can I ask you, do you have anything in your mind for another project?
Yes. I have various things in my mind. Whether they'll come off or not is another thing. I quite want to do something about the aftermath of war in general, not just World War II, but wars throughout the ages, because they always have a similar kind of pattern. There's always hunger and thirst and sort of societal breakdown after the war has happened. So, we always talk about wars, but actually what comes next is just as transformative. So I want to do something about that, sort of going from ancient Roman times all the way up to today.
I love it. And I want to go back and read your book, Savage Continent and the Devastation of Hamburg in 1943. After reading this book on Naples, I definitely want to read those as well. How can people find out more about you, Keith, and how to order your books?
Well, they can look on my website, which is keithlowehistory.com. They can follow me on Substack. I'm always contactable on there. I'm on Twitter. Look me up, Keith Lowe, at Keith Lowe Author. Yeah, there's various ways you can find me and my books.
In our show notes, we'll also put a link to those sites as well. And Keith, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I'm looking at your book collection behind you as I speak to you on Zoom. And have you read all those books, Keith?
I've read at least part of all of those books.
It's impressive nonetheless. But anyway, again, I want to thank you so much for this time and looking forward to seeing whatever other works you're going to get started on. Okay.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure meeting you.
Okay, Keith. Have a good day.
Thank you. And you.
Bye bye.
Okay. See ya.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.